My name is Thomas Paulsen. I'm a member of the executive board of Körber Foundation, which is a private independent foundation based in Hamburg, Germany. And we are a proud member of the 6 members, founding partners of the Paris Peace Forum. Our work basically is about facilitating a better mutual understanding in international relations. Our founder, Kurt Körber, really wanted to make a contribution during the Cold War to facilitate dialogue between East and West, between the West and the Eastern Bloc. And his motto was always, let's talk to each other rather than about each other. And this is still the guiding principle of the foundation, for example, at the Bergedorf of Roundtables that we do each year, or the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, which is our annual big conference in Berlin. So, talking about sanctions are, in a way, between words and wars in international relations. Since the end of the Second World War, the world has seen increasing cases in which restrictive measures have been applied, varying from small-scale travel bans to elaborate economic sanctions. In some cases, they have contributed to states giving up their nuclear program, like Libya, or reinstalling a legitimate government, like in Ivory Coast. Others are remembered for their failure and the disastrous side effects that they had, for example, the sanctions against Iraq in the 90s. Very recently, some have run the idea of sanctions against Saudi Arabia because of the violent deaths of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Jamal has been a good friend. He has participated in many of our events at Körber Foundation, and he was supposed actually to participate in the Paris Peace Forum, and I'm sure he would have made a valuable contribution to this forum, and I really hope that those who are responsible for his death will be held responsible and will be brought to justice finally. Despite their widespread and increased implementation, the success and effectiveness of sanctions as a foreign policy tool remain contested. Some are convinced that they have been and still are an appropriate instrument to prevent military escalation and that they are able to induce policy change. Others argue that sanctions are often being implemented just for the sake of sanctions. Therefore, both academia and the policy community are sometimes at odds on whether sanctions are potion or poison when it comes to international cooperation. I look forward to a very fruitful and interesting debate on the effectiveness of sanctions in international relations. Just a technical remark, of course you will have the chance to ask questions after the panel discussion. You can either do it the new way using the app, but you can also do it the old-fashioned way, just to wave your hand and then ask a question. And now I would like to invite our speakers to come to the stage. Keyu, François, HEISBOURG, and Igor Igor YURGENS. Sorry. And Kevin Rudd will moderate the discussion, and he will make sure that we will talk to each other rather than about each other. Please.
Well, thanks very much. Good to see some of you got out of bed this morning. And for what that's to wake those of you up who did make it. This is an important subject, which is those of us who are here are concerned about whether global governance actually can work in the future. And an important part of that is whether the machinery of global governance can work on core questions of international security, which of course is where sanctions come in. When we look at the challenges facing global governance, it seems to fall into about 2 sets of categories of problems which those who are practitioners and those who observe raise. Number 1, we see the retreat from multilateralism, to regionalism, to bilateralism, to unilateralism, usually on the grounds that multilateralism is deemed to be ineffective, too difficult, too hard, impossible to get agreement, and in bringing about effective policy change. And the second problem we have with global governance is that when some of the architects of global governance begin to defy the principles of global governance themselves and choose to stand outside the system altogether, that creates a problem of legitimacy. Effectiveness and legitimacy, the two rolling challenges in the international debate on the effectiveness of global institutions and global governance. So, standing back again from the immediacy of the debate about sanctions is this: what are the instruments available to the institutions of global governance to cause security behaviours to change? Well, you've got one set over here, which is the body of what we broadly call international law and its inherent normative qualities. And there is a political price to pay and a reputational price to pay for those who seek systematically to violate it. And for those who are just critical and dismissive of the body of international law, I think an historical reflection on why various states have chosen not to undertake various courses of action in history because of the provisions of international law and the damage to their international standing is, I think, worthy of reflection. That's one factor. Not perfect, not complete, but it's there. Of course, then, you have, let's call it, the world of authorised economic sanctions under the provisions of the United Nations Charter and as authorised and determined by the UN Security Council. And thirdly, you have organised or authorised uses of force. The usual term in UN Security Council resolutions is by all necessary means, and we've seen how that's been used and from time abused throughout history post-45. And I suppose finally we have the new and emerging grounds of international criminal law and the role of the International Criminal Court and the individual sanctions regime which it brings about as well. But if we stand back from the cut and thrust of the debate about sanctions, we are looking at these instruments of power and influence to change global outcomes. International law, its moral suasive effect or lack thereof. Sanctions, whether they have teeth or are effective and are properly authorised by the instruments of international law. Then, authorised use of direct military force, plus sanctions against individuals. And most of our debates occur across the range of those four instruments. We're here, of course, to talk about sanctions specifically. And I think as we go to the discussion with this significant panel of individuals, we are going to find ourselves traversing particular questions. One which comes to mind is, if sanctions are embarked upon, then to what extent are the policy objectives set for bringing about those sanctions going to be realised or not? Or will there be unintended consequences? Unintended humanitarian consequences, unintended political consequences, and unintended security consequences? Or is the bringing about of sanctions to simply satisfy domestic political pressure to, quote, do something, as opposed to bringing about material change on the ground? So the nature of the policy objective and its ability to be realised by the sanctions being considered and embarked upon is an important generic consideration. The second goes to the question of legitimacy. And this goes to whether sanctions are authorised through the UN Security Council, as we've seen most recently, for example, in the case of North Korea, leading up to the commencement of negotiations on the North Korean nuclear program, or whether sanctions are applied outside the UNSC, as is now occurring unilaterally by the United States in the case of Iran. Therefore, it is the inherent legitimacy of the sanctions regime itself. And the third one is as follows, which is what happens with the long-term systematic weaponization of the economy, trade, finance, and the currency, in this case the US dollar, over time, if excessively used beyond the remit of international legal processes, namely the UN Security Council. And does that create circumstances where the US dollar is no longer seen purely as an instrument for international trade, finance, and exchange, but actually has a whole bunch of new risks associated with it, which creates doubts about the dollar's long-term future? Those are three sets of issues which I'm sure we will seek to explore today, together with others. So our approach today is to turn it to our panel. You know these fine individuals. Their backgrounds are outlined in the material that you've been given. I'm going to go in the order in which they are seated, start with François, then move to Igor, and then Keyu, and then we're going to open it to discussion. Over to you, François, and we'll see your tour d'horizon of history first, before we go to Igor and current concerns. And Keyu is going to talk to us in particular about the economics of sanctions. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be speaking in this very remarkable forum. A bit of history, and confining myself to the last 200 years or so. Sanctions are not a new feature in the landscape. Whether you're talking about sanctions as a form of coercion which accompanies war, like, let's say, the blockade and the counter-blockade between the British Empire and Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars, or whether you're thinking about sanctions as a standalone form of coercion. Think here of the British initially unilateral decision to ban the trafficking of human slaves early in the 19th century. That eventually morphed from a unilateral into a multilateral regime. It's quite interesting because that example is actually, in terms of legitimacy, between the two worlds of unilateralism and multilateralism. And of course, what history tells us during the 19th century is that then, as today, the nature and the strength of sanctions is very much a function of the power distribution at a given moment in time. During the 19th century and the early 20th century, the concentration of naval power in the hands of the British was such that it was possible to have extraordinarily powerful sanctions. Think of the blockade against the Central Powers 100 years ago during the First World War, with the Central Empires feeling essentially being half-starved by the time of the armistice in 1918. When the power distribution is more uneven, then sanctions somehow become less effective. And let me give a very a couple of examples. In the mid-1930s, there was a multilateral decision to impose sanctions against Italy, which had just invaded Ethiopia. The centerpiece of those sanctions was a complete oil embargo. Italy in those days, like today, had no access to oil of its own, and if the sanctions had been implemented, it is difficult to imagine how Italy would have survived economically. But the new rising power, that is the United States, which was not a member of the League of Nations, decided that its duties as a neutral were not to participate in the oil embargo. That was the end of that story. The sanctions didn't work, and indeed they were counterproductive in the sense that they contributed to pushing Italy into the arms of Hitler's Germany. The other example is what happens in 1941 when the United States, along with its allies, imposes sanctions against Japan. The hope of the sanctions was to bring the Japanese to the negotiating table and to make them cease their invasion of China, which had begun in 1937. But the sanctions were so effective that the Japanese felt compelled to examine a choice between either surrender, which was out of the question in political terms, or war against the United States. And Pearl Harbor was very much a son of a sanctions regime which, in a way, worked too well. The means were enormously effective, but the ends which were achieved were not those which had been sought. And that brings us to the Cold War. In the Cold War, we had an extensive regime of sanctions. We didn't call them sanctions, but an extensive regime of sanctions against the Soviet Union and to, in a slightly different way, against what was then called Red China. COCOM, which was the organizing committee of those sanctions, had a very substantial impact during the 80s in bringing about a peaceful end of the Cold War. The Soviet military-industrial establishment was not able to pursue the arms race under those conditions. And for those who are interested, the French had a particular role to play in this, since we had access to the Soviet evaluations of how the sanctions were working through access to unauthorized sources within the KGB at the time. And we knew that it was working, which is another way of saying that if you have a strong power center, a concentrated distribution of power, then chances are that sanctions are going to be effective in terms of the means that you mobilize. Doesn't mean that you're going to achieve the ends that you are aiming for. Just a word in closing, the historical tour d'horizon, unilateral versus multilateral. First of all, as we have already seen, the distinction is not absolute. The slave trade, or COCOM for that matter, which was obviously not a UN organization, but it was a international, multinational organization. But if we look at the record between straight multilateral and straight unilateral sanctions of the sort which were implemented in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, what do we see? We see swinging UN sanctions against Iraq. Those were mentioned earlier on. Just people should not allow themselves to believe that those sanctions were US sanctions. They were UN Security Council sanctions. And in terms of the mobilization of means, they were extraordinarily effective. But in terms of the outcome, well, they eventually led to a situation which was that of the American unilateral war of 2002-2003 in Iraq and its baleful consequences. On the other side of the ledger, we have the UN sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Arms embargo, constraints on energy, constraints on investment, financial sanctions. And although the sanctions took about 20 years to produce their full effect, it is arguable that they did play a major material role in helping bring a peaceful end to the apartheid regime. And in closing, a word on the Iran sanctions of 2012. Here again, we're talking about a mix of UN sanctions, multinational sanctions, European Union, United States, and purely unilateral sanctions, American sanctions. In combination, these sanctions arguably made it possible to bring Iran back to the negotiating table and to facilitate the negotiation of the JCPOA, the the nuclear deal. What is also arguable, but then that was not the purpose of the sanctions, at least the multilateral ones or the multinational ones, was the sanctions did not bring about a change in the regional behavior of Iran, nor indeed a regime change in Iran. Some Americans may have wanted that, but that was not, once again, the purpose of the overall sanctions regime. So when in this discussion we're going to note that it's very difficult to establish a surefire connection between the sanctions means which are mobilized and the outcome which is sought, failure is probably more frequent than success. The fact is that there are notable cases of success, both in terms of the multilateral and the unilateral sanctions. So to decry sanctions on principle is probably not the most responsible way to approach the topic.
Thank you, François. So you've got positive examples from history, negative examples from history, unintended consequences from history, your Abyssinian example before with Italy. Interestingly, François, the point you raised before about South Africa, in the end, the action which tips the regime over, according to F.W. de Klerk, was the final imposition of financial sanctions. And when the British government changed and Thatcher went and the City of London was on board with that financial set of sanctions, then it was really a matter of weeks before you had the white flag being pulled up and the negotiations with Mandela beginning. Is that an accurate reflection?
But first of all, it's part of the story, and I think it's particularly true when it comes to the critical final phase, when you have one strong leader against apartheid, that's Mandela, and another strong leader who is ready to go to the table, that is de Klerk. The financial sanctions coming on top of the others. And amongst the others, there's one particularly which I did not mention, which I should mention, and that is what I call the cultural and sporting sanctions, which had, by all accounts, a very substantial effect on the morale of the apartheid regime's supporters in South Africa at the time. So it took a full spectrum of sanctions and a inadvertent, but at the end, a very good sequencing of the sanctions. Just the last point, since you mentioned the financial sanctions. We have discovered during the post-Cold War era how effective financial and monetary sanctions could actually be. And the question is, why did we discover this in the post-Cold War era? And part of the answer is that the Americans, who are the dominant power when it comes to the international monetary and financial system, the Americans did not find it necessary, as they did during the Cold War period, to take due heed of the interests of their allies in imposing sanctions. When we have a sanctions problem between the US and Europe vis-à-vis Russian, Soviet gas exports, Maggie Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, François Mitterrand essentially tell Ronald Reagan, no, you're not going to do this. And Ronald Reagan, in effect, says, okay, I'm not going to do this. We were in an alliance. We were working together. It was more important to stay together than to have a particular set of sanctions being imposed. After the Cold War, America has its unilateral moment, and it no longer, you see it with the Helms-Burton Act in the mid-1990s, the discovery also of secondary sanctions, and then all of a sudden we discover positively that the set of sanctions which really worked against Iran between 2012 and 2015 were the financial sanctions. Here we were operating together. Now we have a United States which is operating to a very large extent, as we see in the case of Iran, unilaterally. And the power distribution today is still such that the Americans think that they can afford to do this. And I'm afraid that for the time being, they may still be right.
Fascinating question. I'm sure we'll come back to the future impact of the dollar of this as we move into future economic history. Igor, Russia's experience. We read about it in the newspapers. Tell us.
Tour d'horizon, which François gave us, is fascinating, and that's why I will start with our own Russian tour d'horizon. Ends and means. This is a fantastic question around this. Effectiveness, legal basis, and all of that stuff. Russia, or Soviet Union, was through this a number of times. And let me remind you of cordon sanitaire. A Russian Revolution was sanctioned to a maximum degree by the West, or essentially by the rest of the world. What came out of it? Means were pretty effective. Starvation in Russia, but the ends quite dubious for the mankind, I would say, because Stalinism, which mobilized to the maximum degree at the expense of the thousands of, if not millions of lives lost, created a totalitarian regime, struck a deal, and starting with Rapallo with Germans, in a way created this Hegelian dualism of the European and world politics, and two totalitarian regimes because of the sanctions of Germany and contributions to Germany after the First World War, and cordon sanitaire against Soviet Russia created two maximum totalitarian regimes, and then we ended up in the war when we lost 50 million lives. Here are ends and means. Big question, okay? Then we went through COCOM, then we ended through, the Cold War ended at the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now through a new wave of sanctions, which I'm going to discuss a little later, or describe, we're coming to another means and ways. Probably the sanctions against Russia is effective. I'll give the figures a little later. But here comes the end of unipolar world and a big question to multilateralism again, because Russia is pushed into the pretty unnatural historically embrace of China, and instead of the one united globally governed world, we are facing again bipolarism, where Western democracies and Eastern autocracies will face each other in a pretty nasty way. We don't know the outcome. If we learn how to live in this bipolar world of liberalism against illiberalism, okay, then Helsinki II, then Vienna Congress, something of that. We know the experience of peaceful resolution of this conflict. But again, sanctions at this moment create a more hostile world than it could have been without sanctions. Finishing with this, I would like only to mention that the creation of, after the Second World War, when we supposedly learned some of the lessons of the first one, the creation of the United Nations Security Council, the whole idea was we have 5 major nations without the consent of which, on the most crucial issues, nothing will work in international governance, hence veto. It was not the Soviet veto or Chinese veto or French veto for that matter. It was the recognition that without the consent and the compromise between 5 great nations, nothing will work in this multilateralism. And of course, veto is used and abused by some people, and I will not pinpoint, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the lesson, from my point of view, of the Second World War. Let's try to live in peace if it comes to sanctions, including let's have those sanctions elevated to this level, and let's have a veto right, because otherwise will be otherwise. Okay? So that's as far as the history is concerned. And now we're sort of scrapping this thing, and the might is right, and the United States at the moment pushes hard sanctions on Russia. Economic consequences of these sanctions for Russia. Well, by objective calculations of objective academicians, it's 1.5% of the GDP. It's a lot, but Russia will meddle through. If Russia puts herself back to serious homework and does the absolutely necessary structural reforms which are been written 5 times over by different groups of thinkers, then we will muddle through. The world is big. United States and the West is not the only source of both money and market for Russian goods. It will muddle through. On the philosophical side of it, I would agree with François that economic sanctions is better than hot war. No question about that. Then probably it's at the moment, after Ukrainian crisis, after the Skripal case, after the alleged hacking into the Democratic Party during the election, probably, of course, sanctions is better than the hot war. But looking back into the whole history of this estrangement between Russia and the West, I can tell you there were hard lessons for both sides. Very hard lessons. And the honeymoon of Mr. Putin with the West in 2000-2003 gave us a chance of real common economic space, Vladivostok, Lisbon space, one and united and free and all of that stuff. But then something went sour. I don't have time to describe all of this. And believe me, the fault is on both sides. It's not the fault of Mr. Putin that we became estranged and were pushed again into something else. But now, of course, the naive and romantic story of our marriage between Russia and Brussels is over. It's a great pity, but we see what we see. So, how do to finish my presentation with your question, Kevin? How effective it is. On the political side, ineffective at all. So the liberals in Russia are crashed, and the patriots, nationalists, and those who stand for belligerent Russia, they win. And they are united around their leader, and they look for other friends, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that the regime change through sanctions can be implemented. Economically, I told you, 1.5% minus, and we know that this is only the beginning. I don't know the whole mechanism, but some of my American friends told me that we're at the level 3 of level 10 sanction mechanism, and level 10 would be pretty hard. But then I would ask myself a question. Is this the end of economic sanctions and the beginning of the war? And God forbid if it is. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The question of unintended consequences, or putting it in other terms, effectiveness against the original objective, is the fascinating question through this entire discussion. And I was provoked by your description of what happened on the unintended consequences of what happened 100 years ago. That is the blockade against the Soviet Revolution and the financial sanctions imposed upon Germany and what that resulted in. And then flipping over, you said, look at today, and a parallel set of unintended consequences, the sanctions against Russia after the military action against the Ukraine and Crimea, Russia now embracing China comprehensively, and then the long-term geopolitical consequences of that being question mark. If, and you touched on this as well, that sanctions, however, are better than military conflict, given the options faced with the rest of the international community with what Russia did in the Ukraine in March of 2014, what should the international community have done instead?
First of all, I will not discuss the history of the whole conflict. Many times we were promised that NATO infrastructure will not move to Russia borders. It moves and moves and moves, and Ukraine was the last straw, the way seen from the Kremlin, okay? But I'm not... The proposal at the moment on the table, through track 1, through track 2, through all wise men who want to help in the situation is, of course, Ukrainian peaceful settlement through UN peacekeeping forces. But I think this peaceful settlement and reunification with Donbass, Lugansk, and so on and so forth, of the mainland Ukraine, will not be enough for the Russians and for some others without the new security system. Let me remind you that in 2007, President Medvedev proposed an idea of the new security system after Kosovo, after Albania, after Abkhazia, after Georgia, after Yugoslavia. Helsinki didn't work anymore. OSCE didn't work anymore. Mr. Medvedev proposed the new security system negotiations. It was thrown into the so-called Corfu process and forgotten. And then comes the tragedy which we are facing at the moment. So at the dual initiative of the creation in this bipolar world on peaceful resolution of the conflicts which we have on our perimeter, including Georgia, by the way, and Moldova and all of that stuff, on the one hand, and this creation of the new security system. And this time over, I would probably be bold enough to say, not only in Europe, where it collapsed, especially after INF Treaty being thrown away, and I'm afraid that the START Treaty will be thrown away in 2021, but also the security system in Asia, where it didn't exist. So if we are in a bipolar, which we are gradually getting to, and Russia and China are building a joint force, including military one, and the last maneuvers show that it's pretty effective. So let's come together and let's discuss, on a parallel with the conflict resolution, the security systems in Europe and Asia, which would cover both polars.
Thanks very much. Keyu, you're an economist. The economic impact of sanctions when they've been imposed, but also you might want to weigh into the question of where current sanctions regimes against the Russian Federation are leading in terms of the future level of strategic collaboration between Russia and China. Over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll make 3 points from the perspective of an economist. We have heard a few very important episodes in history in which economic sanctions really were effective and were sometimes so powerful as to be the triggers of war. However, if we take a broader panoramic view of all the cases of economic sanctions that have been imposed throughout history, the picture looks a bit different. And where the majority of the sanctions was mostly ineffective. And in fact, we have more data than just economic sanctions used as a political tool. We have a huge range of data because when countries experience sovereign default, economic sanctions is one of the key punishments, and therefore one of the key methods to prevent sovereign default. So we have now a lot of data looking back in history on the hundreds of episodes of default and whether economic sanctions really were effective or not. And the basic conclusion is that they weren't. And when we talk about financial sanctions, there are alternatives. When Argentina defaulted in the 1990s and even in 2001, financial exclusion to these countries, to Argentina, was only about 3 years versus financial exclusion for 8 to 10 years, where that would actually have a real impact. The economic punishments had very little bite. So that's just taking a broad spectrum of the hundreds of cases of trade, of sanctions that we have observed in history. Secondly, who are you hurting in the end, right? Number one, you might be hurting yourself if it's the U.S. Imposing sanctions on another country. And second of all, it's the domestic citizens that are suffering the most. This reminds me of this, this famous Romanian dictator, which kind of just let Romania be financially excluded for 20 years. It's the people who had to suffer because they couldn't repay the debt rather than go out and ask for debt forgiveness. 20 years people suffered without much electricity, without much food, just for that purpose. So it would work potentially if actually the elites and the government really does care about the people, because the governments, they will never really be directly affected by the economic sanctions. It's the people who are going to bear the consequences. So if the government doesn't really care about the people, then it's the people who will actually suffer. In today's world, one of the fundamental changes that has happened, that has occurred between today and in the past history, episodes of which we have talked about, is very important, and that's the interconnectedness of economics and finance has exploded. And this is even true for advanced economies. In the 1980s is where financial integration really started. So the kind of interconnectedness of globalization from the trade and financial perspective is nothing like what we have seen before, which means that when you punish another, it's possible to punish yourself. So it is very important to make the distinction between a small country or a large country you're trying to sanction against. It will be more effective. It's a small economy. We should not be treating this as kind of a uniform, kind of every country is the same. Economic sanctions work equally across countries. It is not. If it works if it's in a small country without the domestic market, it will probably be likely more effective. If you're trying to sanction against a country, let's say China, the recent trade war is nothing that different from an economics perspective than imposing sanctions because it's a tariff increase on China. The truth is, what it's pushing China to do is to turn much more inward in the domestic economy. Why? Because it's big. It's big, and China's response to the U.S. trade tensions is, okay, fine, we're just going to export less, we're going to raise domestic consumption, and we're going to rely much more on internal innovation, indigenous innovation, and domestic demand. So you just shift the economic balance more inward if you are a big country. So a country like North Korea, a country like Russia would be very, very different in that respect. And speaking about, the effectiveness of sanctions, I think the recent example is really North Korea that we should really contemplate. Now, China was really stepping on the sanctions on North Korea, right before there was some kind of a mitigation of the tension, and it was not effective. Even though most of the exports of North Korea was to China, most of the imports of North Korea was from China, even stepping up on these economic sanctions was not effective in the short term. It's true they might be effective after 20 years, but do we really want the people to suffer 20 years like those citizens in Romania? Only one exception is very effective, and that's the oil sanctions. That's proven to be in history to be very powerful, and one of the aspects which China, if considered on North Korea, would have been effective. Because we are in a much more interconnected world financially, these shocks just propagate throughout the world and comes back to haunt the financial markets, which affect investors, will affect equity markets. There is a co-movement of equity markets that's around 90% around the world. So equity markets move together, bond markets move together around the world. If you set off bad expectations, that's going to hurt everybody. We have seen with the recent trade war that actually the direct, so consistent with our argument, direct economic costs are very small, but indirect economic consequences through feeding expectations into the stock markets are much larger. So that is one thing to note, that something has changed fundamentally in the world compared to 30, 40 years ago, which is this interconnectedness and the interlinkages of the financial world. So last point is back to the position of the U.S. and the exorbitant privilege that the U.S. dollar has enjoyed for so long. Kevin, you raised a very good point, and I can speak a little bit of experience from how China is reacting, which is the increasing stepping up of U.S. sanctions against a number of countries has threatened or has put into question, at the very least, what the role of the dollar is. Now, this is what I call the dollar challenge, and it's above and beyond what the economic sanctions is the unintended consequence of the sanctions, we already have a dollar problem. Why? Because emerging markets are now more than half of global GDP. They need dollars, or they need safe assets, some kind of safe assets to prevent from, to safeguard against financial crises. 90% of the trade is taking place in dollars. They have a much more greater demand of safe assets in the form of a dollar than the U.S. is able to supply. We are in the modern day, what's called a Triffin dilemma. A modern day Triffin dilemma is that the supply of the US dollar is not sufficient to meet the demands of a safe haven reserve currency that is asked by a much larger group of developing countries. Now, the US, even from a purely economic standpoint, is going to be, it's a very difficult thing for the U.S. because there's a fiscal capacity issue. The fiscal constraints on the U.S. because of its demographics and also because it's fiscally constrained means that it's very hard to issue new dollars to serve the supply of the world without creating this expectation that the dollar can't sustain, is not sustainable, and therefore there will be dollar depreciation. So that's a dilemma in the modern day form. And that will be exacerbated, and we're seeing that currently by the political utilization of economic of the dollars. So I was with a bunch of policymakers in China this summer. We were in a policy retreat, and we were talking directly to the economic advisor of President Putin on how to construct a separate system away from SWIFT to create more independent financial exchanges. And that is directly triggered by this growing discontent of the dollar and the U.S. as using this as a tool. So there will be alternatives. And that leads to the final remark, which is that in the background today, there is a new country that can act as an alternative, not quite as powerful, not an equal contender, but an alternative to the ways of the U.S., and that is China. And with developing countries...
I was going to say, name that country.
Your favorite.
Australia.
It's not Australia, my friend. Yeah, it's just to the north of there.
So there is this alternative. And so we want to ask the question, what is, first of all, the defining characteristics of a Chinese leadership? Recently, the U.S.-China tension is really on the horizon. And, the way that China has put this new contention with the U.S., how are we going to peacefully coexist? They named 3 acceptances. But one of the acceptances, and I'm not going to go through all of them, is China will play a greater role in terms of international governance. However, China will tolerate differences around the world and accept differences and respect differences around the world, whether it's political, in terms of system, values, religious, whatever you want. So when you have that bloc, which is probably less likely going to use economic sanctions, use these kind of tools to create, political power, there is a real alternative that we haven't seen in a long time to come.
Thank you, Keyu. We're going to move to questions fairly soon, so use your electronic device to let me know what questions you want to ask, or start waving your hand at me in a few minutes' time. But I want to drill down just a little further on the discussion, which I'm so glad Keyu has opened up, which is, where does the weaponization of the US dollar lead over time? Trade sanctions are one thing. Sanctions in global finance are another. Those which directly go to payment systems, as we have currently through the SWIFT system, and as specifically now applied by the United States in secondary sanctions arrangements over the future of the post-JCPOA world with Iran, has brought this debate from the abstract to the concrete. And we now have the European announced special purpose vehicle, the SPV, to deal with this. There is an open question about its scope and its effectiveness and the political will of any of the Europeans to actually take it on for fear of what the Americans may then do to said European country which hosts such an institution. Leave that to one side. But a question coming back to you, Keyu, is this. The alternative to SWIFT, if it is to be China-based, has a huge precondition attached to it, and that is what happens to the future of the Chinese capital account, what happens to the future of the Chinese currency, which it still is not fully convertible and certainly not fully tradable. In fact, as you know, as an economist, the restrictions on capital account movements are now more acute than they were 3 years ago after the financial crisis of 2015 in China. So there is a huge policy dilemma for Beijing. You want to create a yuan-based or currency basket-based alternative to the weaponization of the dollar, even specifically through an alternative SWIFT system. Then the dilemma for China is to then open up and to liberalize its currency and to liberalize its capital account with a whole series of additional consequences in terms of China's vulnerability to international capital market movements, which the government and the party have been very reluctant to see happen, particularly after the events of 2015. Alternatively, you sit back and just kind of suck it up with the Americans for quite some time to come. But as I see it, that's probably the horns of the dilemma. What do you say?
Dilemma is definitely right. I think the Chinese government is filled with dilemmas and conflicting objectives.
Just try this one.
Objectives, to say the least. The idea, the talk, about setting an alternative payment system is already there. The idea is planted. Execution is very difficult, regardless. Still, so that's one thing to keep in mind. One of China's most important policy agendas, if not the most important policy agenda, is the internationalization of the RMB. And to make China a full reserve currency is going to take a lot of time and a lot of preconditions attached to it, which you have mentioned. Capital account liberalization, exchange rate flexibility, even more important. And China's dilemma is that when the financial system inside the country has so many problems of itself, opening up the capital account would actually just make everything worse, as we've seen the capital flight in 2015 and even with today the depreciation of the RMB. So that is the policy agenda. How the Chinese government will move forward is even unclear to them, to say the very least. However, I just wanted to make the note of the international global financial monetary system has also changed its mind on capital account liberalization. The IMF has recently, in the past few years, revised prescriptions on opening your capital accounts to all these countries, precisely because we have unwanted credit booms and busts when we fully...
So 20 years after the IMF screwed Southeast Asia, they've discovered wisdom, is that right?
20 years is about right. It takes about 20 years to learn the lesson, but that's exactly right. So China's very careful about capital account liberalization. But you're right, the dilemma is precisely in interaction between the economics and the political power China wants to wield. Same thing with the Belt and Road project. There's a lot of economic elements. China doesn't believe it's an equal contender yet. The financial system is not ripe, but it is, in terms of internationalization of the RMB, it is pushing forward in full speed, and we can potentially see lots of progress, especially when the U.S.'s actions is unintendedly trying to push China further along and faster than expected.
If I could just see hands for questions, and as I go to you, Sir François, you wanted an intervention?
Yeah,
a quick one, if I could ask, then I'll go up the hill.
Yeah, a quickie. 20 years is the sort of time frame which is required to establish a new reserve, international reserve currency. If you take an imperfect and an incomplete currency like the euro, it took a bit more than 10 years to get the thing on the road, and as I say, it's incomplete. So it's about 20 years. So the question then is, what happens in the interval? And one of the things that is already happening, although the linkage is not explicit in political or doctrinal terms, is that you also have a development of that other form of non-lethal warfare called cyber warfare. It is not entirely by chance that sanctioned entities tend to catch up to some extent by using the cyber weapon. They're not alone, of course, in doing this. But my expectation is that in this interval, during which the Chinese and others will attempt to set up an alternative to the Bretton Woods system, that we will have not only a rougher cyber war, technology also contributes to that, but we will also see a doctrinal formulation of what I'm currently describing, because what I'm describing exists, but the two categories, the non-lethal warfare of sanctions and the non-lethal warfare of cyber, for the moment are seen as operating in two different spheres. They're not operating in two different spheres.
That's a great point. Jim Keyu has to leave in 5 minutes to catch a train back to London. Anyone got questions for her before she disappears? Because when she leaves, I have to state to the audience it's not a Chinese walkout. She just has an appointment in London. Any questions for Jim Keyu? Gentleman in the front here. Of course, as the question comes to you, Keyu, you might reflect on this as well, is in China internationalizing their renminbi through bilateral currency swaps as opposed to full currency convertibility, let alone opening fully the capital accounts or partly opening them. There's only so far you get with bilateral currency swaps in terms of yuan-denominated international economic transactions. So, over to you.
You said the oil sanction is the only powerful tools against North Korea, but if you look at the history, the financial sanction against Bank Delta Asia was very, very powerful, right? And then North Korea eventually back to the table. So how about the effectiveness of the financial sanctions against North Korea?
So my point was that if we look at a broader perspective of history and lots of data pulled together, which academics have looked at, in general, except for exceptional cases, they have not worked or have been very effective. I think for North Korea, this is only my opinion, oil would have been, the effectiveness of that would have been much shorter. So other kind of sanctions take a longer time to be realized. In terms of financial sanctions, again, if we look at, and there are lots of countries which have defaulted on their sovereign debt, and the financial sanction was the punishment. If we take all this data together, they've always found alternatives, or they can save on their own. They can save in the financial system on their own. So I think with exception of important cases, if we look at a broader range of data, the economics doesn't really show much bite. But also, just one brief sentence, kind of line responding to you. This is not a black and white thing. China moving towards a full international reserve currency. Some of this is already happening. If we think about the fact that 90% of trade was denominated in U.S. dollars until recently, the RMB is already taking up a lot more of that space, especially among the developing and emerging world. A lot of the developing trade, because trade is South-South trade, developing to developing trade is much more intense. They've started denominating their trade in terms of RMB, so it's already happening.
But non-trade financial transactions, it's still a small proportion in the RMB. Okay, Jin Keyu, you are free to leave quietly when you need to, as I take other questions. There's a gentleman up the back here, I think, who wanted to ask a question.
If you look at the French Penal Code from '94, at this letter, you can consider, and ex-minister Claude Chesson said it clearly, that the sanctions against Iraq were a crime against humanity. So the issue is that this sanction, any sanction, should be set by a court, maybe the International Penal Court, not by an executive body like the UN Security Council. What do you think about that?
François, Igor?
Well, first of all, when the Iraq sanctions were put in place after the Gulf War of 1991, the International Penal Court did not exist. That alternative was not in itself on the table. Second problem, as far as I can recall, Claude Chesson and the French government at the time were a complete part of the sanction system. I'm wondering what was driving Monsieur Chesson from saying one thing and doing another. And the last thing, of course, is that the United States of America is unfortunately not a member of the International Penal Court. So it's going to be rather difficult to arrive at a functioning multilateral sanctions system under those conditions.
If I could return as we go to the next question to the North Korea point raised by the earlier questioner, it's been fascinating to see the impact of a sanctions regime which has built since effectively 2006 until the North Koreans got serious about negotiations as of the beginning of 2018. That's 12 years. And so you had cumulative economic sanctions. But you're correct, sir, when you point out to those specifically targeted on the financial transactions of the regime. I was in office for most of that period of time, and we applied the full range of sanctions, but we made, at the same time, large humanitarian exceptions to deal with the unintended consequences effect. So we would find ourselves imposing sanctions on the one hand, most critically against the regime, including, and they were all backed by the UNSC, but on the other hand, writing checks to the World Food Programme to keep people alive during that period in North Korea as well. It is possible with a tailored, textured response to cause elite policy change while seeking to minimise the impact on the civilian population. I think, did this gentleman up here want to ask a question? I think you had your hand up before. Yeah, see he's got his hand up in front of you there? Yeah, that's you, sir.
Mr. Jürgens was saying that that one of the roots of Stalinism were like the Western isolation of Russia, and I think that's problematic. I think the political responsibility for Stalinism is really a Russian responsibility, as well as Russia has the responsibility what it's doing with its neighbor region. Yeah.
So, Igor, do we blame the West for Stalin or Russia for Stalin?
You can do both. And Australia is very much in the picture here too, because
I'm waiting to see this logic.
It is a very close neighbor.
This is going to be a tenuous piece of logic.
But believe me, if those who know Russian history of Bukharenism, Trotskyism, and all other groups who fought for influence, if not for those sanctions, if not for the most drastic regime, probably the option would be, but this is historical fantasy. Cordon sanitaire created the situation when two regimes hurt by those sanctions created an alternative to the civilized world, which the civilized world didn't want to be created.
I have a question online here, which is, I'd love to hear commentary from all panelists on smart sanctions that intend to directly hurt elites. That obviously builds on the earlier response to what happened with North Korean sanctions. François, Igor, your thoughts?
Yeah, essentially the generalization of the so-called Magnitsky sanctions by the name of a Russian lawyer who died under very questionable circumstances in a Moscow prison, and which led the United States to target sanctions on individuals. I'm not sure how important this is in terms of either hurting Russia or changing Russia's behavior. I mean, Igor has said what his thoughts are on that topic. But if I look at a situation like that of Saudi Arabia, the notion that Saudi princes would be forbidden from joining their abodes on the Côte d'Azur in West Kensington and Long Island, I think it would actually have a very severe impact on the relationship between those princes and the current rather non-compos mentis crown prince, who has managed to create the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world in Yemen, who has managed to push Qatar into the arms of Turkey, and who has managed to abduct a Lebanese prime minister. So yes,
you seem to have strong views on Saudi.
On MBS, certainly, yes. And of course, the Khashoggi murder is quite extraordinary in terms of the demonstration of dysfunctionality at the highest level. So in a system where everything is personal, like the Saudi system, I suspect that these sorts of sanctions could be very useful, and the US Congress, in its first and until now only demonstration of bipartisanship since the election of Donald Trump, seems to be pushing very hard in that direction. But I'd like to add something on this score. We have been talking, and this was our brief, about sanctions, that is, state-made decisions, top-down sanctions. We haven't really mentioned bottom-up sanctions, boycotts. When we talked about South Africa earlier on, the NGO-driven part of the sanctions played an important role. When the International Rugby Federation, or whatever the body is called, decided that the Wallabies were not going to be acceptable protagonists in rugby matches, that had a strong impact on the Afrikaner morale, by the account of the people concerned. And here, if I look again at Saudi Arabia, the attitude of investment funds and of investors generally, since the elements concerning the murder of Khashoggi have come to surface, is possibly even more important than whatever decisions may be made by states.
Igor?
Yeah. Well, on smart sanctions, it's between art and science, and they should be smart. And to be smart, they have to be a little bit more long-term, even in terms of conceiving and thinking. You in Western democracy are short-term people. You try to tackle the problem by a shortcut, strong decision, to get the popular vote and so on and so forth. Sometimes you don't think long, and the long thinking is the strength and weaknesses the regimes of like Xi Jinping and Putin. So from this point of view, between art and science, make it smart, we will see what happens after they're really smart. That's number one. And number two, hypocrisy of sanctions. You know, the West doesn't want to sacrifice anything for Ukraine. Anything. You know, the money which you try to lend to Ukrainians, peanuts, you keep talking about, you know, the resistance to this and this and this. When it comes to 1 or 2% of GDP for NATO, for example, question mark. So, on sanctions, at the front, Trump, Theresa May, other people are saying sanctions and Putin will be changed and through regime change because of our pressure. Backdoor, all investors come and say, oh, it's sort of a, but we will find a way out. Believe me, I saw those investors in Moscow. So hypocrisy is also an element. Thank you.
Hypocrisy never occurs anywhere that I've seen it before. And never in politics. We're running out of time, but there's a gentleman down the front here, third row from the front, and then over here. So we'll go to you, sir, ask your question straight away to Eve over here, and then I'm going to go to the panel to answer. Gentleman here, third row from the front, with the red and white striped tie.
We've heard about sanctions being either an alternative for war or a prelude to war. Is there another alternative other than sanctions? What can we do? There's sanctions on money. That's the money artillery. What about information? Is there going to be sanctions on information as well? Thank you.
You mentioned, Kevin, briefly humanitarian exemptions and sanction regimes, and I wanted to come back on that. Obviously, some of the sanctions regimes have had these unintended consequences, either for the civilian population or for humanitarian actors trying to assist them. What are the elements, do you think, in today's hard politic world for getting such exemptions systematically included in, for example, UN sanction regimes? Thank you.
Good, two great questions. Alternatives to sanctions, the question from our colleague from Dubai, and is there a more systematic approach to be adopted for humanitarian exemptions for general sanctions regime? François, Igor, and then we'll close up.
Difficult questions, actually. They're very good, but they're very difficult. On information, well, what comes to my mind immediately is information operations and cyber operations. We're not in the field of sanctions per se. We are in the field of the weaponization of information and the weaponization of the management of digital data. And these are, to some extent, a response to sanctions, the asymmetrical response to sanctions. And indeed, and if this concatenation takes root and is generalized, and there's every sign that these things are happening, then you will get into an extraordinarily disorderly world, because of course, if you ramp up info ops and cyber ops, you are going to create an added incentive and impetus to new and added sanctions. This is the logic which I really fear for the next years. On humanitarian exemptions, not only I consider, of course, that this has to be factored in, and there's no particular reason why it shouldn't be, at least at the multilateral level, possible to factor them in. But also when we think about unintended consequences, let me take something which has been developed by both the UN and the US since 9/11, and that has been the extension to the banking sector of the so-called know your customer obligation. Now, on the face of it, this makes perfectly good sense. It is better to know that Mr. So-and-so, who is a member of Al-Qaeda, has a bank account at this or that bank than not to know it. And you want to enlist the bank's cooperation in making sure that we do know it and that this individual be prevented from using the banking system. This is what UN sanctions on the financing of terrorism and the US and other sanctions, the financing of terrorism, are about. But then you get into the unintended consequences. It is very easy for a bank to refuse to open an account to somebody without having to give an explanation. There is no sovereign obligation for a bank to open an account to anybody. So if you're called Mohammed rather than François, you may find it more difficult to open a bank account in this part of Paris than it would be in a perfect world where the access of a Mohammed should be identical to the access of a François. This is, by the way, unmeasurable, because accounts which are not opened by definition do not figure in any statistic. And yet, unfortunately, there are reasons to believe that the informal economy, the black economy, and therefore the one which can feed into narco and into terrorism, is actually being favored by this sort of know your customer obligation when it's pushed too far, like under the American so-called FATCA legislation, which has extended and branched out internationally without any major objection from any of the foreign banks or countries involved. So unintended consequences also make it difficult to do what you are suggesting, and that is to build in the humanitarian exemption clause, because this is part of the humanitarian aspect.
Igor, last word from you.
Well, we're running out of time, if I understand correctly. So, question number one, I like this parallel of François between sanctions and cyber. Since 2007, we're insisting, all of us, NGOs and International Telecommunication Union, on some kind of regime for cyber, both warfare, so-called, and behavior. Nothing happens, a lot of caucuses, but so diplomacy doesn't work at the moment, unfortunately, on the disarmament, on cyber disarmament, on sanctions. So my question, I mean, my answer to your question is that we have to sit together and to think very hard on what's intended, what's unintended, what can be legitimate through United Nations Security Council, through other international courts, and what's illegitimate. And when do we end this might is a right principle? This is more or less it. On humanitarian aspect, I think that François was very strong. I don't need to add anything to that. Thank you.
Well, folks, you've had a great discussion. 10 quick points I pick up. 1, sanctions in history of successes and a history of failures. 2, better than armed conflict. 3, but if to be effective, must be part of a wider set of policy measures. François' point. And including popular sanctions, rugby in the case of South Africa. Most Australians growing up in the 70s and 80s became radicalised by protests against Australian rugby teams playing. Yeah, no, but we were the Wallabies against the Springboks. That's right, and we were then a better team, but now we are not, and any team is better than ours at the moment. But that's a separate subject. Apologies to all rugby fans who are listening to this. Back to international relations. Popular actions in support of formal sanctions activity, point 3. Point 4, if sanctions are to be effective, make them smart, and the full range of smart sanctions. The point made by our Japanese colleague about those which are regime-specific in terms of inducing actual behavioural change. Number 5, if effective, Eve's point, how do we systematise humanitarian exemptions rather than make that a random afterthought? And we've seen the consequences of that across the world. Number 6, Jin Keyu's point, the intersection of politics and economics. Well, we might say that's self-evident, but in a way it's not. We've got a sanctions regime which we've adopted largely out of the provisions of the UN Charter, though it has, as François reminded us, league and pre-league examples of it in history. But we now have an extent of economic globalisation against the quantum of traded economic activity versus domestic economic activity, the size of financial markets internationally versus domestic financial markets, and the quantum of international financial transactions, which means that the instruments now have a quantum scope infinitely greater than was the case in the 1940s. And when we talk about weaponization, then these are big, bloody weapons against real economic activity. Number 7, the important point raised by a number of speakers, including Igor just now, the intersection between sanctions regimes and their governance and cyber regimes and their governance, and where does that now lead? 8, Jin Keyu's important point, the alternative to SWIFT. If the Americans are going to continue to weaponize the dollar at all levels, then every action brings about an equal and opposite reaction in the international system. And so, fascinating, her reflections on recent meetings in Beijing looking at alternatives to SWIFT. However, the big conditionality, for that to happen at scale, not just in trade finance, but in financial capital, you need convertible currencies other than the dollar. The euro, maybe. But our European friends are discovering what their special purpose vehicle runs into in terms of difficulties against the Americans, against the Iranian regime now. The Chinese globally, prepared to make it convertible, prepared to open the capital accounts, not anytime soon, but the policy resolve seems to be emerging. Number 9, the enduring message of today, beware of unintended consequences, from forcing the Japanese, on one interpretation of history, to do what they did in 41, to look at the impact on sanctions against Italy over Abyssinia in 1936, forcing them into the hands of the Nazis. And then, more recently, Igor's point about what are the unintended consequences in terms of Russia's final economic and geopolitical migration in the direction of Beijing. Profound questions. And finally, I can't let this one go unaddressed. Igor's wonderful point that those of us who belong to Western democratic systems are a bunch of short-termers who can never think of the long-term future. I confess, guilty as charged. But we do have a tempering device called elections. And it's one of what we call as the automatic political stabilizers in Western democratic systems. The alternative, I see in history, tends to be violent revolution. I'll let you conclude as you choose. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our speakers.